Welcome to the church library. Draw up a chair and join us as we sort through these stacks of old books. I'm Marissa Burt.
And I'm Kelsey McGinnis. And here in the church library, we host conversations about popular Christian books. This season, we are dusting off Christian parenting resources.
Our book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting, How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families, examines many of these books, the obscure, the bestsellers, the ones that still pop up in church parenting classes.
Let's see what's on the bookshelves today.
Hello, hey, Kelsey.
Hi. Hi. How's it going?
Good to see you. We're both excited to talk, apparently.
We are very excited. Yeah. This is kind of a strange week for us. We don't have we're not pulling a book off of the shelves this week.
Right. Yes, we're in the church library with you listeners and your questions that you sent to us. So this is an Ask Me Anything Q&A conversation. And I think we're a little optimistic that we can get through all the questions that came in. So we are going to probably end up breaking this into a two-part episode. So if you send in a question and don't hear it addressed, this time look for the follow-up.
Yes, we were so excited to get all of these questions and some just encouraging comments. So thank you so much for all of these. And some questions that I'm excited to talk about because There are things that we haven't thought about or addressed before.
Yeah,
so
some great ones.
Talk about them with you. So if we don't get to your question, we will do another round of this later in the season. We may have to do 2 more rounds of it. We'll see. But we love getting the questions.
Keep the questions coming in. I will try and in the show notes include questions chapter breaks so you can skim the chapter tab. I don't know. In iTunes, there's a chapter tab, but depending on where you're at, and you can kind of see, so you can see the question there and you can hyperlink to it ahead if you want. That might be helpful.
So we will get through as many of these as we can. And this first one that we want, I'm glad we're starting with this one because it probably is the question that we get the most. Yes. And it's the one that we are always a little bit nervous about. So it's good. It's good. Someone wrote in, I recently found your work and I think you do an amazing job. Thank you. It's so kind of you. Mm-hmm. My question is this. We have, unfortunately, a lot of Christian parenting books that are not very helpful. Do you have any recommendations about books, teachers, podcasts, etc.?
Yes.
So, Marissa, why is this a complicated question for us?
It's a complicated question for us because of the work we're doing. When we read all these resources, we see so many people kind of easily platforming themselves and their opinions and preferences and suggesting that equals God's way or the best way to parent. And so it becomes tricky, one, because the work we are doing is primarily observational. We didn't write a parenting book, right? We are not equipped to do that. And so we want to stay in our lane with what we're doing. And also resonate with that desire. That's so understandable. People do want trustworthy resources, and we are parents, and also, of course, do have resources we've found to be personally helpful. But the combination of those two things means that we're very aware that every family is unique and has unique dynamics, unique cultures, unique needs of children and parents. Different methodology might be a good fit for different seasons of family life. Mm-hmm. So many ingredients go into what maybe would make us resonate with a resource as individual mothers. And while we may be willing to recommend that to a friend over a cup of coffee within a certain context, to sort of use the platform that we have for this book to kind of blanket recommend things, we begin to feel like we are participating in the very system we're critiquing. How would you respond?
Yeah, I would say the same thing. I don't like recommending parenting resources just because I know so many parents for whom different things have worked that I think are all okay, depending on the temperament of that parent and the temperament of the kids. And even between me and my husband, I have people who I follow who I really like the models and the language and the posture that they give in dealing with behavior, dealing with meltdowns or
Mhm.
whatever, that work really well for me, but just like my husband is like,
Mhm.
this doesn't work for his personality and the way he relates to our kids. And I think that's also fine.
Mhm.
So for that reason, I just don't like recommending resources. So
Yeah.
and like you said, I feel like it puts us in a position of authority that I'm not really looking for here. My
Mhm.
oldest is 7 years old. I don't have great insight
Mhm.
about like parenting older children. I feel like my experience is so limited.
Mhm.
I don't want to pretend to have that kind of,
Mhm.
I don't know, wisdom or authority
Yeah.
at this point.
Yeah, well, and I love what you said. I think it would I love normalizing that of like there could be multiple paths that would suit different families differently.
Yeah.
And I do have older children, and I think it's interesting that it's less likely that you find parents with older children quick to recommend resources. I think across the board. Certainly there still are some, but I do think when you've parented through multiple seasons and multiple children, you recognize that perhaps a little bit more easily, where you say there's not going to be one specific. Now, what we do have, and we're excited to offer this, that Brazos has helped us design some graphics for
Hmm.
this, and it will be included in the appendix of our book, is we did come up with kind of a guide to kind of walk you through attempting to discern, is this resource, are there green flags in this resource, are there red flags in this resource, so kind of a metric that we will hope will empower you to discern for yourself, how much weight do I want to put in this expert's opinion or in this parenting book. And that's kind of where we thought to try and meet that very understandable desire we know readers will have, to equip you to say, how can I critically think about the resources in front of me to figure
Hmm.
out if I want to hear more from this person, or whether this suits where I and my children are at.
Hmm.
And often when I answer this question, because I get it a lot too, is I'll just encourage people to ask themselves general questions like, how does the person I'm listening to talk about the parent-child relationship? Is it antagonistic? Is it mutual? Like, what is their focus? Is it behavior focused? Is it, just some of those kind of getting curious questions, even in a really rudimentary way, like, is there a heavy emphasis on discipline and spanking? That might give you a little pause. Do they talk about child development, neurodivergence, disability, anything that gives a sense that parenting might not be a one size fits all path? Like, some of those questions, even without the guide, that we do hope you'll get your hands on that guide, can help you think through, oh, is this an encouraging voice for me? Will this equip me as a parent, or is it demanding that I as a parent submit to the authority of the parenting expert and override my
Hmm.
intuition and override my agency? Or am I empowered to really tend the children, the individual children entrusted to my care?
Yeah. Yeah. Is it fair to say that two places we know parents are going that we maybe are willing to name drop because they are moving kind of actively away from punitive parenting
Yes.
would be connected families
Mm-hmm.
and flourishing homes and families. David
Yes.
and Amanda Erickson have a new book called
The
The Flourishing
flourishing family,
Family.
I think.
And I I would say like this isn't a non-recommendation. It's I don't know to what degree these will be helpful to any one particular family, but
Right.
the posture of the people making those resources,
Yes.
my impression of them and of their work is that
Mm-hmm.
they are moving in a direction that honors the personhood and
Mm-hmm.
individuality and dignity of children, which is really
Mm-hmm.
important, and does not treat parental authority as the first principle and
Yes.
does not treat the rod as the primary instrument of
Yes.
asserting that authority. I think for me, those are three like big things.
Yeah.
But again, that's not to say that all of those resources will necessarily speak your family's
Right.
language. Does that make
They
sense?
could be a good starting point. Yeah. Personally speaking, when I, because my husband's a pastor, So people will often ask me, and personally speaking, Connected Families is like the recommendation I will make for a Christian resource, because I really appreciate that it is not a one size fits all. The idea is empowering parents. It respects the agency of parents and children. They take into account psychotherapy, child development, neurodivergence, a number of things, and they have a team of people. So I will personally recommend that one quite often, but with that same disclaimer you've said, like, try it out and see how it lands with you. I think if it feels like a safer recommendation because of those things you've said of respect for families and children valued as individuals. And I like that they have coaching. They have one-on-one coaching by qualified coaches. Mm-hmm. So you can really come with the unique needs of your family and say, how do I serve these children? So I agree. And yes, we did read the Erickson's book after we finished ours, I think. Mm-hmm. And that was refreshing. It's one of the first, I think, traditionally published Christian parenting books we've come across that has kind of robustly argued for something that departs from some of the regurgitated things we critique. So yeah. Those are the ones.
Yeah. I mean, and I realize it's probably not great that it's easier to say, like, here's what we don't recommend. That's probably not very helpful to people. But it is true that there is just a lot more unhelpful or just, straightforwardly bad parenting advice out there.
And some of it, we're going to do a podcast on each question, but the last thing I'll say is that I really resonate with what you said too about personality, because I think even some of these resources that we critique, it's not to say that there's nothing of merit in them, but it's going to fall differently. Like, I know my husband can read something and kind of shrug off a number of things and pick what will serve him. And I'm not wired that way. Like, I am like, oh my goodness, I need to digest all of this. Or certainly as a young parent, I would have been. So some of that depends on, where you're at as a reader and as a person and how empowered you feel to dismiss certain claims and pick out what might serve. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I would also say, if you're a Christian parent who is like, kind of like I was with my first toddler, like floundering for like, where is advice from a person who isn't telling me to spank my child? Mm-hmm. And it felt like, but I also felt some guilt about going outside of Christian resources to find that. I would say, like, embrace the freedom of going and looking elsewhere. Like, there are all of these big name parenting influencers and authors out there with varying approaches. Tina Payne Bryson and Dan Siegel have written so many books together. There's Becky Kennedy with her Good Inside thing now. These are all people who, not perfect. There are problems with all of these approaches that we could get into on another day. But if their approach, like, helps you, like, there are some scripts there that, or they're modeling something that is giving you language to de-escalate something that you could not imagine having done without a threat before. I just think there's so much more freedom for the Christian parent to explore those things. It was really freeing for me to explore Janet Lansbury, who gets a lot of criticism from Christians because she is in what they would call gentle. She would not say she's a gentle parenting person. She'd say she's a respectful parenting person. But she was the first model that I saw for scripts that were confident but not punitive and not threatening. And it was like a light bulb thing. Just for me personally, at where I was with my first toddler as a young parent, just not knowing what to do, I found that to be really freeing. Yeah. And I think there are probably a number of resources out there that for any given person would be helpful.
I think that's great. Yeah. Something we'll often say is there's so much freedom for the Christian parent. There really is. And there's very little prescriptive anything for parents in the Bible, if you're looking to that as authoritative. And so the framework is wide open when you start to see children as your neighbors, to one another with all those lovely one anothering verses, and see this mentoring discipleship journey of parenting rather than the authoritarian hierarchy, you really can be freed up to see what resonates with you. And for me, it's really helpful when I'm reading something to think about, how is this like landing with me? Like, do I feel exhausted when I read this? Do I feel like a heavy weight? Do I feel like I need to just really work hard? Or do I feel encouraged? Do I feel excited? Do I feel like, okay, I can, because I think it's true that as Christians, we believe God has uniquely designed our families and entrusted children to parents in a affinity way. Like he knows the ability of each parent to tend their children. And so I think the methodology we choose should feel energizing rather than exhausting and depleting.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and sorry, we will get to the next question, but one more. Emily Hunter McGowan's book.
Yes, that is one we recommend. Yeah.
We do recommend that book. And we had her on for an interview a couple episodes ago. So if you haven't listened to that, go and listen. And that is less a parenting advice book than a vision for the family.
Yeah.
That I find to be really empowering toward just helping parents have a vision for what their family is for in the world. And I would highly recommend that, just as like a zoomed out,
which I think is so helpful because I think particularly, I don't know where this parent who's writing in is at, but I think particularly when you're in those early years of parenting, you really do want like the how-to, because it can be so overwhelming. It can be so helpful, I think, to have that long range vision to realize that everything doesn't hang on how you got your child to sleep through the night, or everything doesn't hang on some of those things that can feel so big under the instant obedience umbrella. Instead, to say, how do we reorient and rethink about what does it mean to be in family together? What is the grace of family in Christian homes in particular? And yeah, Emily's book is well worth reading for that. Long range vision. I love it.
Okay, next question.
I'm going to read it. Kind of similarly, someone writes, how would you measure a quote unquote healthy church in regards to teaching? Example, if a pastor, elder, etc. frequently makes examples or illustrations from the pulpit about if you're a Christian, you will spank your children, or how children must be restrained and their will shaped, etc. Do these markers immediately raise flags if you like and agree with other doctrines and mission of the church? Also, maybe this one's for me. We'll see if we can get into it. Please shed light on how the Anglican church culture seems so different towards children in general than evangelical churches. I'm fascinated to understand this more as well. Love your podcast and work. Thank you, you all. So nice to hear encouraging words, too, from you guys. Okay. How would you answer that? Measuring a healthy church in regards to teaching. Sounds like they're particularly wanting to know if the church is talking a lot about parenting and spanking and discipline.
Yeah, well, I'm going to let you take the second part of that question, because I'm actually really curious about that as well, because I'm not Anglican and I would love to hear that. But I mean, I'll start by saying if corporal punishment and disciplining children is like a regular theme that comes up, that's to me a red flag. That is a red flag to me, even if you agree with the rest of the mission and vision of the church or the doctrines that are in their statement of faith. That's a red flag to me for a number of reasons. One of which is that if that's the case, I would guess parents are feeling quite a lot of social pressure to spank their children, and quite a lot of social pressure to spank their children toward a particular kind of outcome. Those kinds of teachings tend to be attached to beliefs that the children are rebellious and children are, need to have their will broken. There are some beliefs that come with that kind of like that as a theme in a community. I think that to me would be really troubling.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a red flag for the children in the community, because I don't think children are safe around adults who are willing to preach that from the pulpit collectively. I think the other adults in the community will not be advocating for the well-being of children. And also, I think it's a red flag for adults as well, because the way children in that community are treated is going to be the way parishioners are treated in the church family structure. So those expectations for compliance, or else there's going to be swift discipline, is how the spiritual parents, the pastors or elders or leaders, will be treating congregants. And I would wager, this is just a guess, but that churches that are having that as, I mean, I have never heard a sermon. Maybe it helps to normalize this. I've never heard a sermon on spanking from the pulpit ever, and probably would walk out if I was in a church that did it. I haven't
either. Not in a church I've been physically present in.
Yeah. And we've heard from a number of people that is their experience. I'm not saying that to dismiss. I'm just saying there are churches out there where this would never be sermon fodder in a million years, right? Like, this is not something someone's going to be preaching on. So maybe it helps to normalize that a little bit too, that's maybe an unusual topical series for a pastor to preach on. But I would wager churches that have that are going to have maybe really strict membership covenants. They're going to have ideas about church discipline. There are going to be some other red flags that kind of show that parallel. So I would note that. And I mean, it makes me think of too the passage where the parents are bringing children to Jesus and he takes them for a blessing. The disciples try and get in the way. You know, you all know the story. But Jesus takes him directly in his arms and blesses them. And I really firmly believe that church, the spiritual formation of children, should land like a blessing on them, because this is a really sacred privilege to be bringing small, vulnerable people to Jesus. I think he does relate to them directly. He will, but when Jesus is talking about millstones, he is talking about people who put stumbling blocks in the path of these little ones who damage their faith. And I think that can be new converts and also little children. So I think the idea of a Christian community being all the adults kind of agreeing together that we need to hit children so that they will perform perfectly is very troubling, because that is going to be all wrapped up for those children in how they understand God. So I think down the road too, even if you manage to escape some of the really harmful repercussions of that, that's going to be your faith formation for your family. That's how your children are going to be introduced to God. So that would be troubling for me as well.
Yeah. And I would add to that, one thing that we see a lot in teaching and writing from Christian parenting influencers, experts, is joking about corporal punishment.
It's always here. Yeah.
You can find so many videos of like James Dobson making a joke about spanking, or pastors making jokes about spanking. Jokes about how your kids should be terrified of you. Like there's kind of this like brand of humor that I think adults use to try to lessen their discomfort with causing pain to children, and try to make light of it so that parents are more willing to do it, right? Like, it sort of like makes it not a big deal, or less of a big deal. That is also, to me, a red flag.
For sure. Yeah, I think it shows collective discomfort. And I think it's worth asking, what is it like for a child to hear that? You know, envision a child sitting, I don't know if children are off in childcare when those sermons are happening, but imagine sitting in a room with other people who you have the least power, right? Like, you have no say virtually, and hearing them from the pulpit talk about how your parent needs to do this, or talk about you in which really end up being dehumanizing ways. And I think collectively as a culture, in the church and out of the church, children are still some of the most vulnerable and the most dehumanized people in society. And I think that's awful when it happens in the church. The church, of all places, should be a place where we recognize the full humanity of children, where they are safe, and we all together are working to safeguard them. So yeah, all kinds of red flags. And I would have a lot of red flags over any pastor who's like so keen to talk about that. Yeah. Like, that would just raise a lot of red flags to me too, separately. So I do know we have heard from a number of people who felt that extreme social pressure. You talked about, Kelsey, who were in churches like this. And if they chose not to spank or even just thought about it, talked about it, they were ostracized. Sometimes they were excommunicated or they were pressured. So it can be very intense. And I think the way to break that cycle is to leave. I don't think there's a way to stay there and transform it from the inside. I think you leave and discover fresh air and a healthier place that is not hammering in on that. So, whew.
Yeah. Now, the second part of that question, though.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, short answer. So I don't know if there's I'd be curious to know. Anglicanism is known as a big tent because it is the largest ecumenical denomination globally, which means there's a willingness, right, to say, we might not have it figured out completely the right way. So when you ask, what's the Anglican way of doing something on any topic, you're going to get a really squishy answer from most Anglicans because we highly value that ecumenical nature. However, I do think across the board, there's a high value for children as participants in the service, particularly in liturgical traditions. And Anglicanism has this. So on a Sunday morning, every church has a liturgy for their Sunday morning, right? Even if it's just we sing 3 praise songs and we have a sermon, even if it's very simple, we have a liturgy. But the Anglican service follows the order of service in the Book of Common Prayer. And so you will have much more of an embodied service, I think. So there's standing and sitting, there's collective recitation of confession and the Lord's Prayer, there's collects, which are these prayers of gathering together, there's reading of multiple passages of Scripture. All that to say, it can be a child-friendly environment to participate in a number of the elements of the Anglican service, including the Eucharist, which is the second part of the service. So a lot of Anglican churches will have children there for the majority of the service, and then they process out when the gospel's read, or sometimes at the beginning of service, they'll go to children's class for children's service during the homily or the sermon and the prayers of the people, the portion that's harder for children to access. But what I love about what I've seen in most Anglican parishes is the children's ministry is not separate. They are learning a child-oriented version of what the adults are doing. So they are engaging the church calendar and the moments of the liturgical year. They are having a story time that aligns with the idea of the homily. So I like that as a parent a lot, obviously. I have many thoughts on it. And someone else asked a question about children's church curriculum that maybe we'll touch on that more. But I think because of that, there's really this sense that children are welcome and functioning members. They're welcome in the space. I love it when you hear all the children come back for communion. There's this rustle of noise throughout the congregation. And because children are often baptized as infants, the table isn't fenced. So they participate in the Eucharist early on as well. And so I love that. So I don't know if I would hope that's true. I would love for that to be true across the board in all Anglican churches. It's certainly been the case in the different parishes I've participated in. But I think that might have more to do with the liturgy and the parish model than Anglicanism in particular. I don't know. I hope that answers. I could message me if you want to know more about the Anglican nerd in me.
Would you say that attitudes about parenting are markedly different because of that? Or are people in the ACNA, for example, having read a lot of these same books?
Same thing. You're going to get a bunch of different answers. There are corners. I've seen ACNA clerics recommend Doug Wilson and John MacArthur, right?
Sure.
And that can be disorienting when I see it happen. I'm like, oh no. But so it's going to really depend. But I think on the whole, you find much less prescriptive because of that ecumenical approach. you find much less of a desire to get really prescriptive about those things, and much more of a sense of the parish model of here we all together. The table, the Eucharist, is the high point of Sunday morning, not the sermon, as you find in a lot of Protestant traditions. So that alone shifts some of that power as well. Like the sermon is typically 20 to 25 minutes, and it's on one of the assigned lectionary readings. So you don't find a lot of topical sermon series or that kind of approach, which has uncanny trickle-down effects, impacts like that, where I can never in a million years would my husband or anyone on the preaching team get up and preach a sermon on parenting styles, because their task is to open this one of the assigned scriptures for the day, not to give a lot of application. So I think things like that end up shaping a culture of a church a little bit differently in what people expect from their spiritual leaders. Like, I think if people maybe wanted parenting help, maybe they'd meet with someone on a pastoral staff, kind of one-on-one, but there wouldn't necessarily be that same top down, I think. But that could also just be my experience within Anglicanism. I don't know. But yeah.
Well, and it's not lost on me that a lot of American ACNA churches are refugees from non-denom big evangelical world. So I think a lot of people go to this model not wanting what they found, which I think that explains a lot of the differences in, I think people who choose to go to a smaller Anglican church are wanting their kids participating. They're looking for something that is more embodied. They're looking for that more traditional seeming liturgy. So a lot of that contrast, I think, is explained in who is going to those churches.
I think that's a good point.
So I'm hesitant to say that there's like a massive difference in ideology, but I think people go looking for that.
I think that's a good point, because typically, yes, the parishioners are either going to be people who have grown up and they're kind of rediscovering something about liturgical practice, or this has been, they're cradle Episcopalians or something like this. Yeah. And that's also another corner of the church that maybe was more on the fringe of some of the prescriptive evangelical stuff. Like, I do think those things trickled out into those mainline denominations, but it was less present there to begin with.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And I would also add that I think a lot of like what we think of as like evangelical children's ministry models, I mean, there's just incredible variety there that has more to do with size. So like when we think about like, the Ezzos coming up in John MacArthur's church, Dobson is Nazarene from California. Yeah. A lot of these resources are popularized by people who run in megachurch circles. And I mean, megachurch children's ministry model is like its own thing that forms, I think, a particular view of what children's place is in the church. I don't think that explains a whole lot of things, but I do think there is a lot less consistency in terms of like church culture around children than you might think. I'm thinking of like the SBC, which is the largest evangelical denomination in the U.S. The majority of SBC churches in the U.S. have, I think, fewer than 150 people. And, in most of those churches, there probably isn't like a big kids ministry. Maybe they have nursery and kids are in the rest of the service, participating whatever they're doing. So I think there's the question of church culture and there's a question of what resources clergy are recommending. And those are two different things, but they are related. Both of them shape the way that people in a community view children. So
yeah, that's a great point.
There's some complicating things there, I think.
Yeah. Well, and I think, like I said with the first question too, the way children are treated and the way participants at a parish are treated in the church family mirror each other. So I think in traditions that are less prescriptive in general, that are ecumenical, that they are saying there's space for curiosity or difference or things like that, are going to be less likely to say obey instantly. That cuts both ways as far as how that's reflected. So maybe that's going on in the Anglican tradition as well.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great question. I
It
love
is a
we
great
both answered
question.
that question. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go on to the next one. I was reading requirements for a leader in Second Timothy, I believe. It didn't read like
Mhm.
Ephesians does, addressing children to obey their parents. Instead, it read that the qualified elder should see that his children obey him. Is this different from what God wants of all parents, or is it honorable for us all to require obedience? Quote, require obedience.
Yes.
It gets fuzzy for me. How much should be forced and how much encouraged and trained toward?
This is a good question.
It is a good
Um,
question.
I am going to link in the show notes. I did a little Bible study series on this because someone asked this around this time last year, I think, about both First Timothy and Titus in the list, which typically subtitled qualifications for elders, include this about, I think Titus says faithful children, and First Timothy says, make sure that they obey, basically. So, yeah, this is a good question. Should I dive in?
Yeah.
I don't want to
Yeah,
jump
I
in
mean,
before
you
you
so
if you have something
you
more to say.
dive in on the specifics of these different verses. And I mean, I have
Okay.
lots of thoughts on the second half of this question, but let's
Okay.
start with
Okay,
the
good. Yeah. So
verses.
specifics of the verses. First thing I would say, yeah, it's important to orient this in the context. These are pastoral epistles written to specific congregations of the early church. So the context matters. Yes, principles are still applicable, but these are, and I believe Paul wrote these, but they're written to small gatherings on Crete. That's where the epistle to Titus is, and Ephesus, where Timothy is. And both of those church contexts are in crisis. On Crete, there's like drunkenness and violence and immorality and Judaizer influence. On Ephesus, there's like quarreling and divisiveness and malicious teachers coming in. So Paul is absent, right? So he is saying, you need to appoint some leaders, and here are the kind of things you need to look for. This is the resume you're looking for. And he uses the language of householding there to talk about the episcopon, the overseer that's being appointed. And so I think the idea being is the kind of person you need is going to be the kind of person who is able to be patient, not quarrelsome, who manages his own household well. Those sort of things are how you are going to find a leader that's going to be equipped to handle all of this chaos. So it's less of a checklist, even for qualified leaders, and more of a how do you find people of integrity that will lead well in this situation? And I think it still tracks down the years, right? Like these are all wonderful character qualities of integrity. But church over the years has relied on a number of things to determine it. Some churches have looked at 1 Corinthians 7 and said, we want celibate, unmarried people because they have more energy to devote to things of the Lord. So some churches will use this as a checklist. I think that's a pretty crushing weight, even for pastoral ministers, because it's impossible to secure however we interpret this, right? Like Titus says faithful, I think. So does that mean believing that they're Christians? Does it mean that their children are adults of integrity? Does it mean that they're not Judaizers? Unclear what that means. And I think in First Timothy, it's a little bit unclear. What does it mean that they are yielding or submissive to the overseer? Does that mean they're I think it's less likely that he's talking about like preschoolers obeying instantly. I think it's probably much more likely that this is talking about the dynamic of the extended family. Like, do the other people in the family respond to this person's leadership? Like, is this leader have enough integrity that his children, I think probably teenage adult children are referenced here. Teknon, the Greek word, is wide ranging. But I think it's more likely talking about people who've reached the age of maturity. And I think it's less likely about the performance of the children and more likely about the parents' relationship to the child. And I think we often make it about the child's performance, even when we apply this to pastors and say, well, they're their son or daughter went off the rails, so that brings up questions about their qualification, rather than sort of saying, do their son or daughter still want to be in relationship with them? Like, have they stayed connected, taken good care of this young adult child in such a way that would indicate that they can be trusted with the shepherds and children of God, the sheep and children of God. So I would be kind of like waffly about that. Certainly the way we apply this is so piecemeal. Like, you look at the other qualifications, like not quarrelsome, not a new believer, all these sort of things that we don't really pay a lot of attention to, but this one will get a lot of play for pastors and their families. And I think it has really contributed to a lot of unhelpful effects for the families of leaders. So, that hopefully gives, and I go into a little bit more detail on the reels if you're interested more in like the Bible study aspect. But I think for sure this is only specifically about qualifications for leadership, the idea being how to find trustworthy leaders, not a checklist for people in pastoral ministry. Certainly not a checklist for everyone of like all parents need to make sure their children obey them, which, setting even aside how we read these verses, is just an impossibility. I mean, right? Like, you can't do that. So to set that out there goes against other principles we see in Scripture, where people are free to obey or disobey according to their will. Certainly against things like long suffering, patience, restore the ones who sins gently. All of these sort of things. The idea that we have an impression that children, particularly young children, should be able to achieve perfection in obedience is odd when we as adults know we can't even obtain perfection. So it's kind of odd that we place that on anybody to begin with. But anyway, I'm curious to hear what you would say on this one.
Well, I do think, given all that context, it is a little wild to take that and extrapolate, requiring first-time obedience and obey right away with a happy heart. Like, right. The way that these verses get pulled out and then used to formulate these really prescriptive, rigid expectations for young children, I think just doesn't make much sense. I mean, I understand how you get there, but it kind of ignores all of what you just said, just how contextual this information is in this letter about how to look for a leader, right? Like, it almost, looking for kind of a healthy family dynamic, I mean, it's so broad, right? It has nothing to do with like the expectation is that children are obedient all the time. I mean, like, that seems to have very little to do with this.
It does.
So when this gets pulled out for like child training procedures, that doesn't make a lot of sense. It's just using the text for something it was never meant to be used for.
And if we wanted to, we could say, this text is about how can churches spot trustworthy leaders, which is worlds apart. When Paul does want to say something to parents, he only says one thing, and he says it twice, and it's, fathers, do not provoke or embitter your children. And in Ephesians, he says, but bring them up in the instruction of the Lord. So it's not like he's incapable of saying that. And what he says is very clear. So I think that gives, under that, there's a lot of freedom for the Christian parent. But I think it should sober us that is what maybe we need to be reminded of most, is not to provoke or embitter our children. Like, maybe that should be the first filter by which we're running through things. And the idea, particularly the way this is often used with very young children, of first-time obedience, it reminds me of the way the rod verses are used. It's very strange. It's almost like we have this idea of what parenting young children is, and that's just so glued on our faces that we cannot read Scripture without seeing it through that lens, even though that is a very cultural and not particularly biblical stance to say the expectation for a 4-year-old should be unquestioned. Meaning, anyway, we talk a lot about that elsewhere. So Yes. I hope that answers your question. Feel free to ping
Yeah.
me if you want more on that one.
Well, I do want to say a couple more things about this last
Sure,
part,
sure.
which is it honorable for us all to require obedience?
Mm,
How much should be forced and how much encouraged and trained toward? And
yeah.
this is where language sort of gets in our way, right? Like sometimes Dobson will say, you must require that your
Mm-hmm.
children respect you, which just simply is not something you can do.
Yeah.
You can tell them
Condition.
what
Yeah.
you think respectful behavior is, and then tell
Mm-hmm.
them, if you do not act this way, I will do XYZ. You
Mm-hmm.
can do that, and they can still choose to not. You cannot
Right.
force them. You can threaten them toward that end or coerce them toward that end with
Mm-hmm.
consequences or rewards or what have you. Dobson is a huge fan of rewards. Like
Mm-hmm.
he thinks that that's like the best way to train children. Rewards and consequences, just sort of cause and effect. Um, and I think it doesn't take a whole lot of just sort of sitting with it and thinking, okay, I can't force my children to respect me. I can't force a posture of their heart. I
Mm-hmm.
can't do that. There's a long list of things that I simply cannot make my kids do. I
Mm-hmm.
cannot make my child stop screaming or talk quieter. Like I have one child who talks really loud just when he's just excited, right?
Yeah.
And I can't make him talk quieter. We're practicing over and over again.
Yeah.
But if I perceived his inability to like talk
Mm-hmm.
quieter as like obedience or failing to like
Yeah.
respect my authority,
Yeah.
that would set us up for constant,
Yeah.
constant power struggles.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I can't force feed, or I mean, I will not force feed my child. I suppose you could. There are some
Mm-hmm.
parents who do think that you basically should.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I have heard that before.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think when it comes to talking about forcing things,
Mm-hmm.
we have to be really careful because there are some things that you can't, and many things that you can't
Right.
humanely force.
Yes.
So then the question is, for me, what kind of incentivizing, teaching, guidance, even coercion or boundary setting, what makes sense, right?
Yeah.
And those are hard questions, and I am not going to platform myself to answer those for anyone. But
Yeah.
then the question needs to be something other than how do I make my child X,
Right. And I think it's tricky because there is such an emphasis on just obedience being an honorable thing in Christianity.
Mm.
And it makes sense why the direct line would then go across to like, well, we should be requiring this. And I'm thinking the lectionary has us in the upper room discourse the past few weeks, and I'm thinking about how over and over there we hear Jesus saying, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. And this shows up in the epistles as well. And I don't want to map parents onto God and children. I don't want to do this thing we're constantly critiquing. But I do think it's worth pointing out that in the Christian story, at least, obedience flows from love and connection. It does not flow from like will yourself into it. Or like you said, you can't force respect in someone. Like you can force a performance, but you can't change whether a child respects a parent or not. And so thinking about that, it invites us, I think, maybe to think about a different framework that, and this is one reason I like connected families a lot, because their framework prioritizes connection over behavior, with this idea that if the goal of parenting isn't hierarchy and obedience, but is connection, is love, is discipleship, then all of a sudden you see the framework shifting such that the question about obedience feels less imminent and less important. It's not that it doesn't matter or that you want children who will be rude to other people or will never listen to anyone. Like, no, but you're much more focused on staying connected to the child, understanding what's going on in their behavior, understanding what they're communicating and teaching and discipling and helping to prepare them, which is very different than a power struggle for requiring obedience. And I think training or teaching is a piece of that. I think maybe it would free some parents up to think of, I think your example is a good one of how constantly teaching, how do we talk quieter? How do we practice that? How do we do that together? Because it serves the child well, it serves the family well, the other people around them. But that's really different than saying it's very important that my child obey me as the parent. Mm-hmm. And I think the first example has much more in line, in my view, with Jesus's model that says those in a leadership role are laying down their privilege, are serving the ones under their authority, if you want to say that, which I think it's odd how many Christian parenting resources don't discuss that, don't say, well, even if you believe in this authority framework, like the idea would be we would be serving then. So it's going to look really different versus lording it over children and saying, you have to obey me. So I don't know, lots to say on that. But I think maybe an important question is what's really at the root of that desire to require obedience? Like, is it pressure from extended family or church contexts? Is it, messages received feeling like I need to, or else am I really screwing my child up if I let them get away with this? Yeah. Or is it a desire to say, well, they do need to understand how to obey at different times. Like, how can we practice that or teach for that? I don't know. So yes. Maybe that would be illuminating to dig into what's under that.
Yeah. Yeah. And sorry, one more thing on that, and then we'll move to the next question. When we talk about things that we can't force our children to do, and having to teach it over and over again, I've found it to be really helpful with things like that I can think of many things that God has to try to teach and help me learn over and over and over again. Yes. For as much time as we spend sort of talking about the God-like qualities of parents or parents as God, we pick and choose our examples of that.
We do.
And there are just some things that I teach and we practice over and over again. And I think that's okay. This first time obedience thing, I think, really gets in people's heads when it takes a young child a long time to develop a skill. And the language of just like skills and communication, I think helps a lot. I think a lot of Christian parenting resources shy away from those because they are too morally neutral. They're not sin explicit enough, but I think they really help a parent feel less burdened by all of that. So.
Well, and I think if we could think too of our own discipleship and say, there's an invitation here for, I have come to believe that all our parenting moments aren't just teaching and shaping our children, right? They're shaping us. And so are we being shaped into long suffering, patience, compassion? I do think, yes, it requires a lot of patience to keep doing the training day in and day out, the teaching day in and day out. But to me, that's much more in alignment with the fruit of the Spirit than this sort of expectation that I will be instantly obeyed. Yes. And which totally makes sense for logistics. Like that would make our days run really smooth if everyone would just obey me all the time, the whole world, not just kids, but all the people I interact with, right? But when I think of the fruit of the Spirit, I think, what does that cultivate in us? The kind of patience, persistence, the humility, all of those sort of things. So yeah, but it is a different paradigm. Yeah. Good. Do we have time for one more, do you think?
We do have time for one more. Okay. And I think it's one we should maybe be able to answer a little bit more. We're coming up on an hour now. So, but this is a pretty straightforward question. How does the marketing of Christian parenting resources work? Great question. And we talk about a lot of different marketing pushes in our book because it's changed so much over the past 50 years. So I'll start by saying
Yeah.
the timeline of our book, in terms of the timeline of resources, we
Mm,
sort of start at 1970 with James Dobson, because he is sort of the proto Christian parenting influencer,
yes.
you could say. Um, so when he was working on Dare to Discipline, he did a number of things. And first of all, it's worth saying he was a very good communicator, and
Mm-hmm.
he was interested in getting on the speaking circuit. And
Mm-hmm.
so he was in grad school
Mm-hmm.
finishing his doctorate, and like before the publication of Dare to Discipline, so the late 60s, he's like on like the speaking circuit. You know how like different kinds of events or
Mm-hmm.
churches or I don't know, parent groups
Mm-hmm.
have events. He was kind of on that circuit and would give talks on a number of different topics. And
Mm-hmm.
he was kind of workshopping stuff, and he found that the subject of discipline was really landed with parents. And
Mm-hmm.
so that was how he kind of decided to make that the focus of that first book. And then what followed was a combination of speaking, writing more books. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Dare to Discipline really met its moment and sold really, really well
Mm-hmm.
at a particular time when parents were panicking about like
Mm-hmm.
social upheaval. So Dobson sort of like read the political landscape, wrote a book that was meeting a particular set of panicking parents, and really was able to like leverage that into
Mm-hmm.
more book deals and more speaking things, and started appearing on radio shows, and kind of
Mm-hmm.
had this I want to say slow burn, but it's actually pretty quick
Mm-hmm.
in terms of his rise to fame. So
Mm-hmm.
that's one way, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
kind of, that was Dobson's way. And then we all kind of know what happens next as he keeps writing these books. He founds Focus on the Family, which then becomes its own media
Mm-hmm.
empire. And Focus on the Family is like this juggernaut of family
Mm-hmm.
resources
Yes.
that they platform future parenting,
Mm-hmm.
authors, speakers, all kinds of people. So Dobson helps build the early machinery of Christian
Right.
parenting stuff, if
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Yeah. And once the market's there,
Mhm.
then everyone's seeing the demand, frankly. So
Yeah,
you see
that's exactly right.
publishers and churches past like seeing, oh, people are hungry for this. And so you have, like we talked about last week, the Ezos parenting empire started, and you have branding around different content that people
Yes.
are producing. So sometimes you have early on you see pastors writing a parenting book, right? Like they're pastors, they're going to speak topically on this. So Chuck Swindoll is a parenting book, John MacArthur has a parenting book, Larry Christensen is a parenting, kind of that
Mhm.
starts. But then you begin to see kind of branded of around a class or around a topic, and then that's going to become that person's niche where they're a Christian parenting expert. And I think conferences and homeschooling and endorsements are
Yeah.
three of the key ingredients that propelled people and still do. I'm thinking of Ginger Hubbard, who also wrote under the name Ginger Plowman, Don't Make Me Count to Three, who kind of, she really liked Ted Tripp's book a lot, Shepherding a Child's Heart. She began kind of teaching it informally to a group of other moms, and she ended up sending Ted Tripp's publisher her resources. She met with him to pitch him a book, which he originally said, no, you're too young, but then went on board with it. And so she's a good example of like a pre-influencer who
Yeah.
hustled.
Yeah.
She was pitching her talks to conferences nationally. She had a couple of like set talks she would give based on Ted Tripp's book. And once you're on that circuit, I think you are a known name, and it can kind of snowball from there. And then once you have that platform, you become a coveted endorser. Like when we look at these early editions of these books in the 80s and 90s, Gary Ezzo's name is on a lot of other parenting books. So you become someone that people trust to give credibility to other new parenting people. And then it becomes about book sales and platform, which it's interesting in the influencer era. You see those same ingredients, but maybe flipped a little bit, in that often if someone has a big platform, they'll be invited to write a book. Like Emma's for Mom is a good example of this, Abby Halberstadt, where she was a mommy blogger and then had a really big Instagram platform, and I think was approached to write a parenting book and has since done 2 or 3 of them.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And so you kind of see it flip a little bit. But yeah. And then book sales, of course, always with any kind of book or resource contribute to somebody getting another one. But it can be a pretty lucrative pipeline when you throw in conferences or speaking engagements and things like that, particularly because Christian parenting, there can be a million iterations. You can write a book for boys, for girls, for teens, for preschoolers, for baby, it's kind of can be an endless opportunity.
Yes. Yes, I think that's right. And over the past, 10 years, influencer world has changed things a bit. You mentioned Abby Halberstadt, and the ways that you can get noticed as a potential parenting influencer have changed a little bit. You still will have just, if you are a pastor of a big successful church and you want to write a book on parenting, you can probably get a major publisher to let you write a book on parenting. Yeah. But there's also a lot of looking at someone's platform and like how much does this person check all the influencer boxes?
Oh, okay, I'm not available. I'm recording.
And if they check all those influencer boxes, right? They have a persona that is appealing. They have this lifestyle that's appealing. They project a certain level of success, either as just sort of a professional person or in the home. I think Justin Whitmel Early, the author of Habits of the Household, is a good example of this, right? That book, Habits of the Household, has been very successful. He's a lawyer. He's a Christian. He appears to be a very successful one. He's written a couple of successful books. And that has seemed to be enough for people to say, oh, I want to know what this guy thinks about this and this. And if you follow him on Instagram, he will share with you, here's a bedtime liturgy I do. Here's a prayer I pray over my sons. Here's a blah, blah, blah. And all of that has allowed him to really build this very successful brand around himself. His next book is not a parenting book. He's really just sort of making a go of it as like a Christian author, speaker, influencer. And has successfully done that by being influencer first.
Yeah, and I think you also see a little bit more grassroots stuff, right? Yes. Because of influencer culture, you have people who can self-publish or do coaching or courses kind of if they're marketable. Or I'm thinking even of Risen Motherhood, which was kind of like young, I'm pretty sure they were new moms, kind of like working through their thoughts and processing in their own social media community. And then it grew really into this ministry where they were producing resources for other moms and a number of things. And recently they kind of retired from that, which I thought that was a really interesting trajectory to see. And I think could only happen in the influencer age, right? And I think in our book, I think you point this out at one point where they had over 300,000 followers. And when you compare this to like the attendance at a megachurch, for instance, or something like that is a lot of reach. And whether people like that choose to find traditional publishing and marketing for their approaches or not is kind of neither here nor there because they have connected with the people who want to hear from them. And I say that in a pretty neutral way about all these things, because apart from whatever you think about the content people are producing, it's being marketed to you 100%, 100%. And it's good, I think, to be eyes wide open about that because whatever someone's intentions, like you are a consumer, you're being sold something. And in the parenting world, it often is something you may or may not really need. They're part of marketing something to you is pitching that there's a need for it to meet. In your life. So that's an interesting part about anything that really kind of falls under self-help, which I think parenting kind of does. Yeah.
And I think one interesting thing to watch right now is like parenting resources will almost always try to answer or meet a fear or meet an anxiety of the moment. So there are going to be, and there already are, but there will be more in the next year or two, a lot of resources about tech, right? Like Jonathan Haidt's Anxious Generation showed parents are just like, give me all the information about how to help my kids in this. So we are going to have a bunch
and
of
AI, I'm sure, is coming. I'm sure there's going to be parenting books about that.
Yes, we are going to have a Christian parenting, group of resources that help parents answer that question. There'll probably be some good resources there. There'll probably also be some really fear-mongering kind of stuff that are trying to like sort of force you into your culture war corners.
Right.
So it's just a good thing to watch out for. And the other one is gender. Like there is a lot of Christian parenting content out there that is sort of fear-mongering with parents about what's being taught about gender in schools. Your children, your boys are being brought up to not be masculine enough. Your girls are being brought up to not be feminine enough, because there is so much kind of broad panic about what gender means. And I think watching for those little themes in lectures, video content, especially like when, if you're scrolling TikTok or Instagram reels and a talk comes up about parenting, like what are those themes? Are the themes kind of playing to like a current fear? That's such a common marketing tactic for
It is. And it's interesting to survey resources over a number of years because you see the themes are the same, but it shifts, right? Like tech has always been there, but it used to be video games or movies or, things like this would be the conversation. Or gender certainly has always been there, but it pivoted differently throughout different eras. So yeah, that's something to just kind of clock as you're consuming resources. And two, we live in an age that really, I've mentioned this before, like I'm really glad I wasn't a new parent. It was like pre-social media explosion, because we do live in the flood of information age where the idea is you just need more information and that will equip you more and help you more. But I think a lot of times it's just all this stuff coming at an endless stream and no space to even gauge some of those things we were talking about at the beginning. Like, how is this landing in my body? Like, how am I feeling this? And instead it's a constant stream of messages that are subtly playing on fears or worries or more you should be doing, more you should be changing, more you should try and control. It can just be an exhausting kind of pipeline, but it's so attractively packaged and it hits our, dopamine sensors and everything. So we feel like it's really helping us. Like it's really helping us do better when in reality, we might be letting go of some of our own agency as parents.
Yes.
So yeah, the marketing thing is real, the real deal.
Yeah, it is. And we could talk more about that another time actually. And we talk about it in the book as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, those are all great questions.
Those are such great questions. We didn't even get through half of them.
I know. I was afraid this was
so great to talk. We will, if you wrote in, thank you so much. We will get to your question eventually, probably in part 2. We'll probably try and cover the rest of these in part 2 because some of these are short ones. They're not as long.
Yeah, but those were great. Thank you for these. And if you have a follow-up question after one of those, obviously there's only so much we can do in just over an hour here. But we would love to hear if any of that sort of pinged anything for you or seemed like that you have something in the back of your memory that's like, oh, that makes me think of this. We'd love to know. So
yeah, we love to engage, really envision this as a conversation. And we will try and maybe we'll do part 2 for the next episode, or maybe we'll sprinkle that off. We also have a couple good interviews coming up, a couple more resources to dive into as we finish out this season. We've, 5 or 6 more episodes we want to do. So thank you for joining us. Thanks for the conversation, Kelsey. As always, it's good to talk with you.
Thank you as well, Marissa. This is so fun. And I can't wait to dive into the rest of these questions. So thanks for joining us in the church library, and we'll see you next time.
We are so glad you've joined us in the church library today. This is Marissa Franks-Burt
and Kelsey Kramer McGinnis. And if you liked what you heard here, we think you'll be interested in reading our forthcoming book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting: How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families.
You can pre-order it now wherever books are sold, and it'll be on shelves in October of 2025.